On this day in history, April 1st, 527, Byzantine Emperor Justin I names his nephew Justinian I as co-ruler and successor to the throne. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the life of Justinian. Justinian I, born 483, died 565, Flavius Ansius Iustinianus, surnamed the Great, the most famous of all the emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, was by birth a barbarian native of a place called Terrasium in Illyricum, and was born, most probably, on May 11, 483, probably of Slavonic parentage. His own name was originally Upruda. Eustinius was a Roman name which he took from his uncle Justin I, who adopted him, and to whom his advancement in life was due. Of his early life we know nothing, except that he went to Constantinople while still a young man, and received there an excellent education, though it is alleged that he always spoke Greek with a barbarian accent. When Justin ascended the throne in 518, Justinian became at once a person of the first consequence, guiding, especially in church matters, the policy of his aged, childless, and ignorant uncle, and soon coming to be regarded as his destined successor. On Justin's death in 527, having been a few months earlier associated with him as co-emperor, Justinian succeeded him without opposition to the throne. About 523 he had married the famous Theodora, who, as empress regnant, was closely associated in all his actions till her death in 547. Justinian's reign was filled with great events, both at home and abroad, both in peace and in war. On this day in history, April 2nd, 1513, having spotted land on March 27th, Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon comes ashore on what is now the state of Florida, landing somewhere between the modern city of St. Augustine and the mouth of the St. Johns River. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of discovery and settlement of Florida. The romance and the tragedies of the early history of Florida give it a unique place in the annals of the American states. Within 20 years after the first voyage of Columbus to the New World in 1492, an expedition was being organized to seek for a fabulous fountain of youth and for riches in the new and inviting land. This expedition was followed by others seeking wealth or to establish the Christian faith among the savages. In turn, these were followed by French Huguenots, who were seeking a place of religious freedom, but the zeal of the Spaniards soon brought an unhappy end to their search. Florida also has the honor of containing the oldest European settlement within the bounds of the original United States, as St. Augustine was founded in 1565, 42 years before the English were successful at Jamestown. The Spanish Council of the Indies claimed that since 1510, fleets and ships have gone to Florida, and Florida is shown on the earliest known map of the New World, the Cantino map of 1502. In 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, circa 1460, died 1521, who had been with Christopher Columbus on his second voyage and later been governor of Puerto Rico, obtained a royal grant authorizing him to discover and settle Bimini, a fabulous island believed to contain a marvelous fountain or spring whose waters would restore to old men their youth, or, at least, had wonderful curative powers. Soon after Easter Day, he came in sight of the coast of Florida, probably near the mouth of the St. Johns River. From the name of the day in the calendar, Pascua Florida, or from the fact that many flowers were found on the coast, the country was named Florida. De Leon seems to have explored the coast, to some degree, on both sides of the peninsula, and to have turned homeward fully convinced that he had discovered an immense island. He returned to Spain in 1514, and obtained from the king a grant to colonize the island of Bimini and the island of Florida, of which he was appointed adelantado, civil and military governor. And in 1521 he made another expedition, this one for colonization as well as for discovery. He seems to have touched at the island of Tortugas, so named on account of the large number of turtles found there, and to have landed at several other places, but many of his men succumbed to disease and himself was wounded in an Indian attack, dying soon afterwards in Cuba. Meanwhile, in 1516, another Spaniard, Diego Morello, seems to have sailed for some distance along the west coast of the peninsula. The next important expedition was that of Panfilo de Narvaez. In 1527 he sailed from Cuba with about 600 men, soon reduced to less than 400. He landed early in 1528, probably at the present site of Pensacola, and for 6 months remained in the country, he and his men suffering terribly from exposure, hunger, and fierce Indian attacks. In September, his ships being lost and his force greatly reduced in number, he hastily constructed a fleet of 5 boats, re-embarked, probably to sea while off the coast of Texas. Only 4 of his men, including Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, succeeded, after 8 years of Indian captivity and of long and weary wanderings, in finding their way to the Spanish settlements in Mexico. Florida was also partially explored by Fernando de Soto in 1539-40. In the summer of 1559, another attempt at colonization was made by Tristan de Luna, who sailed from Veracruz, landed at Pensacola Bay, and explored a part of Florida and, possibly, southern Alabama. Somewhere in the region he desired to make a permanent settlement, but he was abandoned by most of his followers and gave up his attempt in 1561. On this day in history, April 3rd, 1043, Edward the Confessor is crowned King of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Edward. Edward the Confessor died 1066, so called on account of his reputation for sanctity. King of the English, was the son of Ethelred II, the Unready, and Emma, daughter of Richard, Duke of Normandy, and was born at Islip in Oxfordshire. On the recognition of Svein as King of England in 1013, Ethelred, with his wife and family, took refuge in Normandy, and Edward continued to reside at the Norman court until he was recalled in 1041 by Hardicanute. He appears to have been formally recognized as heir to the throne, if not actually associated in the kinship, and on the death of Hardicanute in 1042, all folk received to be king, though his actual coronation was delayed until Easter 1043. A few months later, Edward, in conjunction with the 3 great earls of the kingdom, made a raid on the Queen Mother Ealhgefu, or Emma, seized all her possessions, and compelled her to live in retirement. In the earlier years of the reign, the influence of Earl Goodwine was predominant, though not unopposed. His daughter Edith, or Eadgith, became Edward's queen in 1045, but the king's personal tastes inclined much more to foreigners than to Englishmen, and he fell more and more into the hands of foreign favorites from beyond the sea. Between Godwin, representing the spirit of nationalism, and these favorites, especially their leader, Robert of Jumièges, successively Bishop of London and Archbishop of Canterbury, there was war to the knife. In 1046, Magnus, King of Norway, who had succeeded Hardicanute in Denmark, had claimed to succeed him in England as well, threatened an invasion, but the necessity of defending Denmark against his rival Svein Estrithson prevented him from carrying it into effect. In 1049, Godwin's son Svein, who had been outlawed for the seduction of Abbess of Leominster, returned and demanded his restoration. This was refused, and Svein returned into exile, but not before he had with foulest treachery murdered his young kinsman Bjorn. He was, however, inlawed next year. The influence of Godwin, already shaken, received a severe blow in 1051 in the appointment of Robert Jumièges to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the same year saw the triumph of the foreigners for the moment complete. Edward, indignant at the resistance offered by the men of Dover to the insolence of his brother-in-law Eustace of Boulogne and his French followers, ordered Godwin to punish the town. Godwin refused. The king, at the prompting of the archbishop, then summoned a meeting of the Witan, at which the old charge against Godwin of complicity in the murder of Etheling Alfred was to be revived. About the same time came news of a fresh outrage by the foreigners. Godwin gathered his forces and demanded redress, while the Earls Leofric of Mercia and Siverd of Northumbria hastened to the side of the king. Civil war seemed imminent, but at length a compromise was effected by which the matter was referred to a meeting of the Witan to be held at London. At the appointed time Godwin presented himself at Southwark, but his followers were rapidly deserting him, nor would the king give hostages for his security. Alarmed for his safety, he fled to Flanders, where his son Harold went to Ireland, but their exile was brief. The tale of Godwin excited universal sympathy, for he represented the cause of national independence. Encouraged by assurances from England, he sailed thither, and joining forces with Harold sailed along the south coast and up the Thames. The king would have resisted, but found no support. Yielding to circumstances, he allowed himself to be reconciled, and Godwin and his house were restored to their old position. The queen at the same time was brought back from the monastery at Werwell, whither she had been dispatched at her father's flight. The foreigners had already ignominiously fled the country, and thenceforth the influence of Godwin, and, after his death, of Harold, was supreme. In 1063 Harold made a great expedition into Wales, in which he crushed the power of King Gruffudd, who was killed by his own people. But despite his prowess and his power, he was the minister of the king rather than his personal favorite. This latter position belonged to his younger brother Tostig, who, on the death of Siward in 1055, was appointed Earl of Northumbria. Here, Tostig's severity and arbitrary temper rendered him intensely unpopular, and in 1065 Tostig's subjects broke into revolt. They elected Morkere as their earl, then, marching south, demanded Tostig's banishment. Edward desired to crush the revolt by force of arms, but he was overborne and forced to submit. The election of Morkere was recognized, and Tostig went into exile, intensely mortified at this humiliation, and henceforth his health failed rapidly. He was unable to be present at the consecration of his new abbey of Westminster, the foundation of which had been the chief interest of his closing years, and on January 5th, 1066, he died. The virtues of Edward were monkish rather than kingly. In the qualities of a ruler, he was conspicuously deficient. Always dependent on others, he ever inclined to be the unworthier master, but the charm of his character for the monastic biographer, and the natural tendency to glorify the days before the Norman oppression began, combined to cast about his figure a halo which had not attached to it in life. Allowed to keep her property by William the Conqueror, his widow, Edith, passed the remainder of her life at Windsor, dying on December 19th, 1075. On this day in history, April 4th, 801, King Louis the Pious captures Barcelona from the Moors after a siege of several months. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Barcelona. During the Roman period, Barcino, a town of the Lusitani, raised to the rank of a colony under the name of Julia Faventia, afterwards Agudi and Pia, gradually replaced Tarragona, as a seaport. The Bar Huluna of the Muslims, who captured it in 713, it became, after its reconquest by the Franks in 801, the chief town of Marca Hispanica, and, by the end of the 9th century, of the independent countship of Barcelona, with recognized supremacy over its neighbors. The union in 1137 of Catalonia and Aragon was followed by the rise of political importance of the wealthy merchant class, from which were elected, at first exclusively, the members of the municipal council, Consell de Cent, of Barcelona. Barcelona now became one of the foremost trading cities of the Mediterranean, the rival of Genoa and Venice, and its maritime code, Libro del Consulo del Mar, dating from the late 13th century, was for long widely recognized as authoritative. By 1479, the date of the union of Aragon and Castile, the city had directed its direct jurisdiction by the technical inclusion within the municipality of protected areas scattered over eastern Spain, and exercised a virtual hegemony over the rest of the seaboard of Aragon. In municipal politics, a democratic tradition had been established by the entry to the council and final predominance there of representatives of the popular classes. Marked independence of the central authority had already been shown by the successful resistance of the city to John II of Aragon during the 10 years ending in 1473. The relations of Barcelona with the new central government were prejudiced by the monopoly of the American trade granted to Andalusia, which persisted until 1778. In 1640, a flirtation with France and the revival in favor of Louis XIV of the title of Count of Barcelona was illustrative of a tendency to play off a third party against Madrid rather than any serious leanings towards France. During the War of the Succession, Barcelona was taken in 1705 by the English under the Earl of Peterborough, and the Archduke Charles was enthusiastically welcomed by the population, who paid the price of their enthusiasm when Concile de Cent was abolished by Philip V after the recapture of the city in 1714. By this, and by the suppression of the Catalan fueros in general, relations with Madrid were further embittered. No permanent traces were left of the French occupation of Barcelona between 1809 and 1813. In the modern period since 1815, the history of Barcelona has been marked by episodes indicative of social, industrial, or political unrest. The combination of different forms of unrest in one complex movement by characteristics of the city. Especially serious were the uprisings of 1835, when 11 convents were destroyed, and of the tragic week in 1909, when over 60 churches and religious buildings disappeared from the city's architectural inheritance. The infantry committees of defense had their headquarters here in 1916, and it was here that the movement began which led to the establishment of the Military Directory in 1923. The evolution of the labor movement from the earlier Pacific phase of the General Workers' Union, Unión General de Trabajadores, founded at the Second Barcelona Congress in 1888, to the phase characterized by the terrorist action of Sindicato Único led to the revolutionary strike of 1919 and 1920. Barcelona was also the headquarters of the Catalonian separatist movement, and on August 2, 1936, following the outbreak of civil war in Spain, it became the seat of an autonomous Catalonian government. It was a main center of government strength. Nationalist superiority in air and artillery strength caused the city to fall into rebel hands January 26, 1939, almost without resistance. The fall of Barcelona, with its great industrial facilities, doomed the government cause and led to its final surrender in the following March. Barcelona suffered from air attack during the war, notably a 3-day raid in 1938. On this day in history, April 5th, 823, Lothair I is crowned King of Italy by Pope Paschal I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the life of Lothair. Lothair I, born 795, died 855, Roman Emperor, was the eldest son of the Emperor Louis I and his wife Ermengarde. Little is known of his early life, which was probably passed at the court of his grandfather Charlemagne, until 815, when he became ruler of Bavaria. When Louis in 817 divided the empire between his sons, Lothair was crowned joint emperor at Aix-la-Chapelle and given a certain superiority over his brothers. In 821 he married Ermengarde, died 851, daughter of Hugo, Count of Tours. In 822 undertook the government of Italy, and on April 5, 823, was crowned emperor by Pope Paschal I at Rome. In November 824 he promulgated a statute which reserved the supreme power to the secular potentate, and he afterwards issued ordinances for the good government of Italy. On his return to his father's court, his stepmother Judith persuaded him to secure a kingdom for her son Charles, a scheme which was carried out in 829. Lothair, however, soon changed his attitude, and spent the succeeding decade in constant strife over the division of the empire with his father. He was alternately master of the empire, and banished and confined to Italy, at one time taking up arms in alliance with his brothers, and at another fighting against them, whilst the bounds of his appointed kingdom were in turn extended and reduced. When Louis was dying in 840, he sent the imperial insignia to Lothair, who, disregarding the various partitions, claimed the whole of the empire. Negotiations with his brother Louis and his half-brother Charles, both of whom armed to resist this claim, were followed by an alliance of the younger brothers against Lothair. A decisive battle was fought at Fontenoy on June 25, 841, when, in spite of his personal gallantry, Lothair was defeated and fled to Aix. With fresh troops he entered upon a war of plunder, but he was compelled to surrender Aix to his brothers. In June 842 the brothers met on an island in the Saône, and agreed to an arrangement which eventually developed into the Treaty of Verdun, 843. By this, Lothair received Italy and the imperial title, together with a stretch of land between the North and Mediterranean seas lying along the valleys of the Rhine and the Rhone. He abandoned Italy to his eldest son, Louis, and remained in his new kingdom, engaged in alternate quarrels and reconciliations with his brothers, and in efforts to defend his lands from the attacks of Normans and the Saracens. In 855 he fell ill, and divided his lands between his 3 sons. On September 23rd, he entered the monastery of Prüm, where he died 6 days later. On this day in history, April 6th, 46 BC, Julius Caesar defeats Caecilius Metellus Scipio and Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, at the Battle of Thapsus. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the battle. Battle of Thapsus, 47 BC. After his victory at Pharsalus, Julius Caesar followed Pompey to Egypt, where the Pompeians accumulated a large army and were joined by Juba, king of Numidia. A battle was fought at Ruspina, in which Caesar was almost overwhelmed, after which he moved to Veta and besieged it. Withdrew on account of lack of supplies, and in order to compel Scipio to battle, marched on Thapsus, an ancient city of North Africa in the province of Byzacium, the modern province of Tunis, on the coast more than 100 miles north of Carthage. Thapsus contained large military stores, was strongly garrisoned, and blockaded by Caesar's fleet. On February 4th, 47 BC, he arrived before the city and immediately besieged it. This drove Scipio into action, for he at once advanced on Thapsus and threw up 2 entrenched camps, one for his own men and the other for Juba's 8 miles south of the city. The maneuvers which are now followed were controlled by a saltwater lake, the modern Sebka de Moknine, which lies to the southwest of Thapsus. Caesar had entirely surrounded the town, but Scipio considered that it was still possible to relieve it from the south. Caesar had foreseen the likelihood of this move, and had built a strong fort in the center of the strip of land which separates the eastern margin of the lake from the sea. When Scipio advanced, he struck this fort, and being unable to take it, turned back and decided to march round the lake and force the northern approach to the city. This he did, and constructed 2 camps north of the lake. Though Caesar would have preferred to defer battle until he had taken Thapsus, he now determined to attack Scipio before he had finished his entrenchments. Leaving Asprenas, the proconsul, and 2 legions to carry on the siege, with the rest of his force he marched against Scipio. One half of his fleet he left to continue the blockade, and the other he ordered to sail down the coast and make a demonstration against Scipio's rear. Placing his left on the coast, Scipio drew up his army in 3 lines, with his elephants and light troops in front of his right and left wings, his Numidian cavalry on the left, and the rest of his cavalry and light troops on the right. Advancing on him, Caesar also extended his army into 3 lines with the 2nd and 10th legions on the right, the 8th and the 9th on the left, and 5 legions in the center. His flanks he covered by 5 chosen cohorts, supported by archers, slingers, and cavalry. As Scipio's camp was but half dug, Caesar's men wished to advance at once. Caesar, however, was not overly anxious to precipitate the battle, because he was largely outnumbered by the Numidian cavalry. Whilst he hesitated, the 10th legion suddenly sounded the charge, which was repeated all down the line. The archers and slingers soon overwhelmed Scipio's elephants with their arrows and stones, driving them back on their own line, where they not only demoralized the infantry, but scattered the left-wing horse. The infantry lines then clinched, fighting each other until sunset, when Scipio's right wing became demoralized. This affected the center, and soon the entire line broke and sought refuge in the half-completed camp, which was speedily captured by a double envelopment of Caesar's wings. Scipio's force was annihilated in an awful slaughter, of which Mommsen writes, "If the hydra with which they fought always put forth new energies, if the army was hurried from Italy to Spain, from Spain to Macedonia, from Macedonia to Africa, and if the repose ever more eagerly longed for never came, the soldier sought, and not wholly without cause, the reason of this state of things in the unseasonable clemency of Caesar. 50,000 corpses were strewn over the battlefield of Thapsus, and among them were several Caesarian officers known as opponents to the new monarchy." In this battle, neither strategy nor tactics are remarkable, but what is so is the insubordination of the men and their growing sense of mastership in the new order which Caesar was creating. He wished to found an empire, and aimed at a complete victory, constantly taking tremendous risks and ignoring the units. The soldiers wanted peace so that they could return to their homes and families. At Thapsus, a battle was begun between the will of Caesar and the desires of his men. It was slow and progressive, and did not end until Alaric had sacked Rome. On this day in history, April 7th, 451, Attila the Hun captures Metz in France, killing most of its inhabitants and burning the town. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Metz, the Roman Divodurum, was the chief town of the Medio Matrici, and was also called by the Romans Medio Matricia. Metz is a contracted form. Caesar describes it as one of the oldest and most important towns in Gaul. The Romans, recognizing its strategic importance, fortified it, and supplied it with water by an imposing aqueduct, the remains of which still exist. Under the Roman emperors, Metz was connected by military roads with Toul, Langres, Lyon, Strasbourg, Verdun, Reims, and Trier. Christianity was introduced in the 3rd century. In the middle of the 5th century, the town was plundered by the Huns under Attila. Later, it came into possession of the Franks, and was made the capital of Austrasia. On the patrician of the Carolingian realms in 843, Metz fell to the share of the Emperor Lothair I as the capital of Lorraine. Its bishops, whose creation reaches back to the 4th century, now began to be very powerful. Metz became a free imperial town in the 13th century and soon became prosperous. Having adopted the Reformed doctrines in 1552 and 1553, it fell to the hands of the French and was defended against Charles V by Francis, Duke of Guise. At the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Metz, with Toul and Verdun, was formally ceded to France. It was taken by the Germans in 1870 and ceded to them in 1871. It was retroceded to France after World War I, but was occupied again by the Germans in June 1940 during World War II. On this day in history, April 8, 1250, as part of the Seventh Crusade, the Ayyubids of Egypt captured King Louis IX of France in the Battle of Fariscour. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the Seventh Crusade. As the loss of Jerusalem in 1187 produced the Third Crusade, so its loss in 1244 produced the Seventh. As the preaching of the Fifth Crusade had taken place in the Lateran Council of 1215, so that of the Seventh Crusade began in the Council of Lyon of 1245. But the preaching of the Crusade by Innocent IV at Lyon was a curious thing. On the one hand, he repeated the provisions of the Fourth Lateran Council on behalf of the Crusade to the Holy Land. On the other hand, he preached a crusade against Frederick II, and promised to all who would join the full benefits of absolution and remission of sins. While the papacy thus bent its energies to the destruction of the Crusades in their genuine sense, and preferred to use it for its own political objects what was meant for Jerusalem, a layman took up the derelict cause, with all the religious zeal which any pope had ever displayed. Paradoxically enough, it was now the turn for the papacy to exploit the name of crusade for political ends, as the laity had done before, and it was left to the laity to champion the spiritual meaning of the crusade even against the papacy. It was at the end of the year in which Jerusalem had fallen that St. Louis had taken the cross, and by all means in his power he attempted to ensure the success of his projected crusade. He sought to mediate, though with no success, between the Pope and the Emperor. He descended to a whimsical piety, and took his courtiers by guile in distributing to them, at Christmas, clothing on which a cross had been secretly stitched. He started in 1248 with a gallant company, which contained his 3 brothers and the Sieur de Joinville, his biographer, and after withering in Cyprus, he directed his army in the spring of 1249 against Egypt. The objective was unexpected. It may have been chosen by St. Louis, because he knew how seriously the power of the Sultan was undermined by the Mamluks, who were, in the very next year, to depose the Ayyubid dynasty, which had reigned since 1171, and to substitute one of their number as Sultan. Damietta was taken without a blow, and the march for Cairo was begun, as it had been begun by the legate Pelagius in 1221. Again, the invading army halted before Mansoura, December 1249. Again, it had to retreat. The retreat became a rout. St. Louis was captured, and a treaty was made by which he had to consent to evacuate Damietta and pay a ransom of 800,000 pieces of gold. Eventually, he was released on surrendering Damietta and paying 1/2 of his ransom, and by the middle of May 1250 he reached Acre, having abandoned the Egyptian expedition. For the next 4 years he stayed in the Holy Land, seeking to do what he could for the establishing of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He was able to do but little. The struggle of papacy and empire paralyzed Europe, and even in France itself there were few ready to answer the calls for help which St. Louis sent home from Acre. The one answer was the Shepherd's Crusade, or Crusade of the Pastoraux, a religious jacquerie, as it had been called by Dean Milman. It had some of the features of the Children's Crusade in 1212. That, too, had begun with a shepherd boy. The leader of the Pastoraux, like the leader of the children, promised to lead his followers dry-shod through the seas, and tradition even said that this leader, Master of Hungary, as he was called, was the Stephen of the Children's Crusade. But the anti-clerical feeling and action of the shepherds was new and ominous, and moved by its enormities, the government suppressed the new movement ruthlessly. None came to the aid of St. Louis, and in 1254, on the death of his mother, Blanche, the regent, he had to return to France. On this day in history, April 9th, 1241, as part of the Battle of Liegnitz, Mongol forces defeat the Polish and German armies. Included in the following is the excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of Liegnitz. Liegnitz, a town in the Prussian province of Silesia, Germany, on the Katzbach, just above its junction with the Schwarzwasser and 40 miles west by northwest of Breslau, on the main line of railway to Berlin via Sommerfeld. Population of 1939, 83,000. Liegnitz is first mentioned in an historical document in the year 1004. In 1163 it became the seat of the Dukes of Liegnitz, who greatly improved and enlarged it, and who are buried in the Church of St. John. On the death of the last Duke of Liegnitz in 1675, the duchy came into the possession of the empire, which retained it until the Prussian conquest of Silesia in 1742. On August 15, 1760, Frederick the Great gained a decisive victory near Liegnitz over the Austrians. It consists of an old town and several suburbs. The palace, formerly the residence of the Dukes of Liegnitz, and rebuilt after a fire in 1835, is used as the administration offices of the district. The Ritter Akademie, founded by the Emperor Joseph I, was reconstructed as a gymnasium in 1810. The Church of Saints Peter and Paul, restored 1892 to 1894, dates from the 14th century. The manufactures are considerable, the chief articles made being cloth, wool, leather, tobacco, pianos, clogs, sugar, carriages, and machinery. Its trade in grain and its cattle makers are likewise important. There are large market gardens in the suburbs. On this day in history, April 10th, 1545, the settlement of Villa Imperial de Carlos V, now the city of Potosi, in Bolivia, is founded after the discovery of huge silver deposits in the area. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Potosi, a city of Bolivia, capital of the department of Potosi, 47 miles southwest of Sucre, or 106 miles by the post road. Population, from 1942 estimated, 45,000. Potosi stands on a barren terrace on the northern slope of the Cerro Gordo de Potosi, 13,612 feet above sea level, and is one of the highest towns in the world. The famous Cerro from which its name is taken rises above the town to a height of 15,381 feet, a barren, white-capped cone, honeycombed with mining shafts. The foundation of the city dates from 1547, 2 years after the first discovery of silver on the Cerro by an Indian herder. Charles V conferred upon it the title of Villa Imperial. From 1545 to 1800, the crown tax of 1/5 upon the mineral product amounted to £32,600,000, showing an acknowledged output of £163 million. The output to 1864 has been estimated at more than £400 million, but the annual output at the beginning of the 20th century barely exceeded 400,000 ounces. The town is regularly laid out with streets crossing each other at right angles. The age-begrimed buildings, many of which are unoccupied and in ruins, are commonly of adobe. A large plaza forms the conventional center, around which are grouped various religious edifices. The Government House, Town Hall, National College, the old Royal Mint, dating from 1572, and the Treasury. The city has a massive plain cathedral, which in part dates from early colonial times, and in part from the closing years of Spanish rule. The water supply is derived from reservoirs constructed during the years of the city's greatest prosperity. Potosi, long accessible from the outside world only by rough mountain roads, now has rail connections with Rio Mulatos on the Antofagasta-Bolivia line and with Sucre. In 1611, the population of Potosi was reported to be 160,000, which probably included the whole mining district. A part of the diminution since then is explained by the fact that the great majority of the mines on the Cerro were abandoned. In recent years, valuable deposits of tin have been found, and many of the mines have reopened. On this day in history, April 11th, 491, Flavius Anastasius becomes Byzantine emperor with the name of Anastasius I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Anastasius. Anastasius I, born circa 430, died 518, Roman emperor, was born at Dyrrhachium no later than AD 430. At the time of the death of Zeno, 491, Anastasius, a palace official, Silentiarius, bore a very high character, and was raised to the throne of the Roman Empire of the East, through the choice of Ariadne, Zeno's widow, who married him shortly after his ascension. His reign, though afterwards disturbed by foreign and intestine wars and religious distractions, commenced auspiciously. He gained popular favor by a judicious remission of taxation, and displayed great vigor and energy in administering the affairs of the empire. The principal wars in which Anastasius was engaged were those known as the Isaurian and the Persian Wars. The former, 492 to 496, was stirred up by the supporters of Longinus, the brother of Zeno. The victory at Cottium in 493 broke the back of the revolt, but a guerrilla warfare continued in the Isaurian mountains for some years longer. In the war with Persia, 502 to 505, Theodosiopolis and Amida were captured by the enemy, but the Persian provinces also suffered severely, and the Romans recovered Amida. Both adversaries were exhausted when peace was made, 506, on the basis of status quo. In 507, Anastasius built the strong fortress of Daras to hold Nisibis in check. The Balkan provinces were devastated by invasions of Slavs and Bulgarians. To protect Constantinople and its vicinity against them, he built the Anastasian Wall in 512, extending from the Propontis to the Euxine. The emperor was a convinced Monophysite, but his ecclesiastical policy was moderate. He endeavored to maintain the principle of the Henetikon of Zeno and the peace of the Church. It was the uncompromising attitude of the Orthodox extremists and the rebellious demonstrations of the Byzantine populace that drove him in 512 to abandon this policy and adopt a monophysitic program of religious unity in the East at the cost of Rome's hostility. His consequent unpopularity in the eastern provinces was utilized by an ambitious man named Vitalian to organize a dangerous rebellion, in which he was assisted by a horde of Huns, 514 to 515. The rebellion was finally suppressed by a naval victory won by the general Marinus. The financial policy of Anastasius was so prudent and economical that it gained him a reputation for avarice and contributed to his unpopularity. He died July 9th, 518. On this day in history, April 12th, 240, Shapur I becomes co-emperor of the Sasanian Empire with his father, Ardashir I. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Shapur. Shapur I, from 241 AD to 272, son of Ardashir I. The Persian legend, which makes him the son of an Arsacid princess, is not historical. Ardashir had, towards the end of his reign, renewed the war against Rome. Shapur conquered the Mesopotamian fortresses Nisibis and Karhe and advanced into Syria, but he was driven back by C. Phorius Timotheus, father-in-law of the young emperor Gordianus III, and beaten at Racina, 243. Shortly afterwards, Timotheus died, and Gordianus was murdered by Philip the Arabian, who concluded an ignominious peace with the Persians, 244. When the invasion of the Goths and the continuous elevation of new emperors after the death of Decius, 251, brought the Roman Empire to utter dissolution, Shapur resumed his attacks. He conquered Armenia, invaded Syria, and plundered Antioch. At last the Emperor Valerianus marched against him, but suffered near Edessa the fate of Crassus, 260. Shapur advanced into Asia Minor, but was beaten by Ballista, and now Odenath, prince of Palmyra, rose in his rear, defeated the Persian army, reconquered Karhe and Nisibis, captured the royal harem, and twice invested Ctesiphon, 263 to 265. Shapur was unable to resume the offensive. He even lost Armenia again. But according to Persian and Arabic traditions, which appeared to be trustworthy, he conquered the great fortress of Hatra in the Mesopotamian desert. and the great glory of his reign was that a Roman emperor was by him kept prisoner to the day of his death, in the valley of Istakar, near Persepolis, under the tombs of the Achaemenids at Nakshi Rostam. Shapur is represented on horseback, in the royal armor, with the crown on his head. Before him kneels Valerian, in Roman dress, asking for grace. The same scene is represented on the rocks near the ruins of the towns Darabjar and Shapur in Persis. Shapur left other reliefs and rock inscriptions. One, at Nakshi Rajab, near Persepolis, is accompanied by a Greek translation. Here he calls himself the Mazdayasinian, worshipper of Ahura-Mazda, the god Sapores, king of kings of the Aryans, Iranians, and non-Aryans, of divine descent, son of the Mazdayasinian, the god Artaxerxes, king of kings of the Aryans, grandson of the god King Papak. Another long inscription at Hajibad, Ishtakar, mentions the king's exploits in archery, in the presence of his nobles. From his titles we learn that Shapur I claimed the sovereignty over the whole earth, although in reality his domain extended little farther than that of Ardashir I. Shapur built the great town of Gundev Shapur near the old Achaemenian capital Susa, and increased the fertility of this rich district by a barrage through the Quran River near Shuster, which was built by the Roman prisoners and is still called Bandi-i-Kaisar, the mole of the Caesar. Under his reign, the prophet Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, began his preaching in Persia, and the king himself seems to have favored his ideas. On this day in history, April 13th, 1111, Henry V is crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, going over the history of Henry. Henry V, born 1081, died 1125, Roman Emperor, son of the Emperor Henry IV, was born on January 8, 1081, and after the deposition of his elder brother, the German King Conrad, died 1101, was chosen as his successor in 1098. In spite of his oath to take no part in the business of the empire during his father's lifetime, Henry was induced by his father's enemies to revolt in 1104, and some of the princes did homage to him at Mainz in January 1106. In August of the same year, the elder Henry died, and his son became sole ruler. In 1107, a campaign to restore Bolshevik II to the Dukedom of Bohemia was partially successful, and in the year following, the king led his forces into Hungary, where he failed to take Pressburg. In 1109, he was unable to compel the Poles to renew their accustomed tribute, but in 1110 he succeeded in securing the Dukedom of Bohemia from Ladislaus I. The main interest of Henry's reign centers in the controversy over lay investiture, which had been thrice prohibited by Pascal II. In 1110, Henry went to Italy with a large army, and at Sutri concluded an arrangement with Pascal by which he renounced the right of investiture in return for a promise of coronation, and the restoration to the empire of all the lands given by kings or emperors to the German Church since the time of Charlemagne. The king presented himself at St. Peter's on February 12, 1111, for his coronation and the ratification of the treaty. The words commanding the clergy to restore the fiefs of the crown to Henry were read amid a tumult of indignation, whereupon the Pope refused to crown the king, who in turn declined to renounce the right of investiture. Henry then left the city carrying the Pope with him, and Pascal's failure to obtain assistance drew from him a confirmation of the king's right of investiture and a promise to crown him emperor. In 1112, Lothair, Duke of Saxony, rose against Henry, but was easily quelled. In 1113, however, a quarrel over the succession to the counties of Weimar and Orlemund gave occasion for a fresh outbreak on the part of Lothair, whose troops were defeated at Warnstadt. Having been married in 1114 to Matilda, or Maud, daughter of Henry I of England, the emperor was confronted with a further rising initiated by the citizens of Cologne, who were soon joined by Saxons and others. Henry's forces were defeated at Helvoetsluis in 1115, and complications in Italy compelled him to leave Germany to the care of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, Duke of Swabia, and his brother Conrad. After the departure of Henry from Rome in 1111, a council declared the privilege of lay investiture, which had been extorted from Pascal, to be invalid, and Guido, Archbishop of Vienna, excommunicated the emperor, but the Pope refused to ratify this sentence. The quarrel entered upon a new stage in 1115 when Matilda, daughter and heiress of Boniface, Margrave of Tuscany, died, leaving her vast estates to the papacy. Crossing the Alps in 1116, Henry took possession of Matilda's lands. By this time, Pascal had withdrawn his consent to lay investiture, and the excommunication had been published. The Pope was compelled to fly, and the Emperor was crowned a second time by Burdinus, Archbishop of Braga. Pascal was succeeded by Gelasius II in January 1118, but Henry secured the election of an antipope who took the name of Gregory VIII. Finally, in the Concordat of Worms, September 1122, Henry renounced the right of investiture, with ring and crozier, recognized the freedom of election of the clergy, and promised to restore all church property. The new Pope, Calixtus II, agreed to allow elections to take place in presence of the imperial envoys, and the investiture with the scepter to be granted by the emperor as a symbol that the estates of the church were held under the crown. Henry was received again into the communion of the church, after he had abandoned his nominee Gregory to defeat. The emperor's concluding years were occupied with a campaign in Holland, and with a quarrel over the succession to the Margravate of Messine. In 1124 he led an expedition against King Louis VI of France, and turned his arms against the citizens of Worms. He died at Utrecht on May 23, 1125. On this day in history, April 14th, 966, following his marriage to the Christian Dobrovka of Bohemia, the pagan ruler of the Polans, Mieszko I converts to Christianity, an event considered to be the founding of the Polish state. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of early Poland. We possess no certain historical data relating to Poland till the end of the 10th century. The earliest Polish chroniclers are of little help to us. The only facts of importance to be gleaned from them are that Prince Ziemowit, the great-grandfather of Mieszko, Mieczkoslav I, 962 to 992, wrested from the vast but tottering Moravian Empire the province of Krobakia, extending from the Carpathians to the Bug, and that Christianity was first preached on the Vistula by Greek Orthodox missionary monks. Mieszko himself was converted by Jordan, the chaplain of his Bohemian consort Dobrawa Orbona, who became the first bishop of Poznan. The Slavonic people, whose territories then extended to the Elbe and embraced the whole southern shore of the Baltic, were beginning to recoil before the vigorous impetus of the Germans in the west, and the acceptance of Christianity might give them respite from further attack. This was thoroughly understood by Mieszko's son Boleslaw I, 992 to 1025, who aimed at securing the independence of the Polish Church as an additional guarantee of the independence of the Polish nation, and elevated the church at Gniezno in Great Poland into a metropolitan see, with jurisdiction over the new bishoprics of Kraków, Breslau, and Coburg, created in territory which he had recently conquered. Boleslaw was the first Polish prince to bear the royal title, and his reign resulted in the formation of a vast kingdom extending from the Baltic to the Carpathians, and from the Elbe to the Bug. In the next generation, much of the territory which he had won was lost, and Poland itself was ravaged by neighboring enemies. But under Boleslaw II, 1058 to 79, and Boleslaw III, 1102 to 39, some of the lost provinces, notably Silesia and Pomerania, were recovered, and Poland was at least able to maintain her independence against the Germans. Boleslaw III, moreover, with the aid of St. Otto, Bishop of Bamberg, succeeded in converting the heathen Pomeranians, 1124 to 28, and making head against paganism generally. On this day in history, April 15th, 1071, Bari, the last Byzantine possession in southern Italy, is surrendered to Robert Guiscard. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the city. Bari, also known as Barium, an archiepiscopal see in Apulia, Italy, capital of the province of Bari, on a small peninsula, 69 miles northwest of Brindisi, by rail. Population, from 1815, about 15,000. From 1901, 77,478. From 1936, 162,238 in the town, 197,918 in the commune. The closely built old town is on the peninsula to the north, and the new town to the south is laid out rectangularly. The former contains the Cathedral of St. Sabino, begun in 1034, destroyed in 1156 and rebuilt in 1170 to 78. The exterior preserves, in the main, the fine original architecture, notably the dome and the campanile. The Church of St. Nicola was founded in 1087 to receive the relics of this saint, brought from Myra in Lycia, and now beneath the altar in the crypt. The facade is fine, and the interior is divided into 3 naves by columns, with galleries over the aisles, has fortunately not been restored. The church is one of the 4 Palatine churches of Apulia, the others being the cathedrals of Acquaviva and Altamora, and the church of Mont St. Angelo sul Gargano. The small church of St. Gregorio belongs also to the 11th century. The castle, built 1233-40 by Frederick II, and strengthened in the 16th century, lies on the west side of the old town. The old harbor lies on the east side of the peninsula, and the new on the west. In 1930, a yearly fair of the Fiera del Levante was inaugurated in Bari to strengthen Italy's ties with the Balkans and the Near East. In the fair of 1937, 3,137 Italians and 1,624 foreigners took part. Bari is the home port of the Puglia line. In the new town is the Ateneo, containing the provincial museum with Hellenic collections and a large theater. Bari is the seat of command of the 9th Army Corps, and the most important commercial town in Apulia. It manufactures olive oil, soap, carbon sulfide, tiles, oriental carpets, and playing cards, and has a large iron foundry and important flour mills. In Roman times, Barium was the junction between the coast road and the Via Traiana. Its harbor, mentioned as early as 180 BC, was the principal one of the district, as at present, and was the center of a fishery. It became in 852 a seat of Saracen power, and in 885 the residence of the Byzantine governor of Apulia. In 1071 it was captured by Robert Guiscard. Some of the Norman Crusaders crossed thence to Constantinople in 1096-97. In 1156 it was razed to the ground, but acquired new prosperity under Frederick II. After this it was under various masters, last of all the Sforzas, 1464 to 1557, and after the death of Bona Sforza, widow of Sigismund I of Poland, it was assigned to Naples by arbitration of the emperor. On this day in history, April 16, 1582, Spanish conquistador Hernando de Lerma founds the settlement of Salta, Argentina. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the city. Salta, a city of Argentina, capital of a province of the same name, and seat of a bishopric, on a small tributary, the Aray, of the Passage or Jormento, 976 miles by rail north by northwest of Buenos Aires. Population 38,574. Salta is built on an open plain, 3,560 feet above the sea, nearly enclosed with mountains. The climate is warm and malarial in summer, but mild and pleasant in winter. Nearby is the battlefield where General Belgrano won the first victory from the Spanish forces, 1812, in the War of Independence. There is the large mestizo element in the population, and the Spanish element still retains many of the characteristics of its colonial ancestors. Salta was founded in 1582 by Governor Abreu under the title of San Clemente de Nueva Salvira, but the site was changed 2 years later, and the new settlement was called San Felipe de Lerma. In the 17th century, the name Salta came into vogue. On this day in history, April 17, 1521, the trial of Martin Luther over his teachings begins during the assembly of the Diet of Worms. Initially intimidated, he asks for time to reflect before answering and is given a stay of 1 day. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Worms. Worms was known in Roman times as Borbeto Magus, which in the Merovingian age became Vermatia. The town had before Caesar's time become the capital of a German tribe, the Vangiones. Drusus is said to have erected a fort here in 14 BC. In 413, the Emperor Jovinus permitted the Burgundians under their king Guntar, or Gunther, to settle on the left bank of the Rhine between the Lauter and the Ney. Here they founded a kingdom with Worms as its capital. Adopting Arianism, they came into conflict with the Romans, and under their king, Gundar, or Gundekar, the Gunther of Nibelunglide, rose in 435 against the Roman governor Aetius, who called in the Huns against them. The destruction of Worms and the Burgundian kingdom by the Huns in 436 was the subject of heroic legends afterwards incorporated in the Nibelungenlied and the Rosengarten, an epic probably of the late 13th century. Worms was rebuilt by the Merovingians and became an episcopal see, first mentioned in 614, although a bishop of the Vangiones had attended a council at Cologne as early as 347. There was a royal palace from the 8th century, and in it the Frankish kings, including Charlemagne, occasionally resided. Under the German kings, the power of the bishops of Worms gradually increased. Otto I granted extensive lands to the bishop, and in 979, Bishop Hildebold acquired comital rights in his city. Burchard I, bishop from 1000 to 1025, destroyed the castle of the Franconian house at Worms, built the cathedral, and laid the foundations of the subsequent territorial power of the see. There were frequent struggles between the bishops and the citizens, who espoused the cause of the emperors against the church and were rewarded by privileges which fostered trade. The city retained its freedom until 1801, in spite of the bishops, who ruled a small territory south of the city on both sides of the Rhine, and resided at Ladenburg near Mannheim till 1622. The city of Worms was frequently visited by the imperial court. The Concordat of Worms closed the investiture controversy in 1122. Their perpetual peace, Ewiger Landsfrei, was proclaimed by the Emperor Maximilian I at the Diet of 1495, and Luther appeared before the famous Diet of 1521 to defend his doctrines in the presence of Charles V. 4 years later, Worms formally embraced Protestantism, and religious conferences were held there in 1540 and 1557. It suffered severely during the 30 Years' War. The French under Mellac burned the city almost entirely in 1689, and it only fully recovered from this blow in recent years. Thus, the population, which in its prosperous days is said to have exceeded 50,000, had sunk in 1815 to 6,250. By the Treaty of Worms in 1743, an offensive alliance was formed between Great Britain, Austria, and Sardinia. The city was annexed to France at a Peace of Luneville in 1801, together with the bishop's territories on the left bank of the Rhine. The remaining episcopal domains were secularized in 1803 and given to Hesse-Darmstadt, which acquired the whole by the Vienna Congress in 1815. On this day in history, April 18, 1689, Bostonians rise up in rebellion against Sir Edmund Andros. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the early colonial and provincial period of Boston. It is probable that the early Norsemen explored Boston Harbor. Captain John Smith made explorations and mapped the locality in 1614. A party of prospectors from the Plymouth plantations visited it in 1621. It was known to the white man long before a real settlement was made, and there were several individual settlers living within the borders of the present city. William Blackstone, on the Tri-Mountain Peninsula, Thomas Walford in Charleston, and Samuel Maverick on Noodles Island. In 1628, the Massachusetts Bay Settlement, the first great Puritan settlement, was inaugurated at Salem, under John Endicott as governor. He was joined in a few months by Winthrop, who, in 1630, with his followers, settled temporarily at Charlestown. Finding some difficulty in water supply, he crossed the river at the invitation of Blackstone, and made his settlement in Shawmut, or Tri-Mountain, as it was variously called. The accepted day from which the beginning dates its beginning is September 17, 1630. When it was ordered by the Court of Assistants that the town should be called Boston, after the Boston in Lincolnshire, the leading town of the region from which the principal Puritan leaders had come. For a short time, Boston, Newton, Cambridge, and Charlestown flourished in about equal degree, but the excellent commercial situation of Boston soon put it to the fore, and in 1632 it was made the capital of the colony. During the first 10 years, 20,000 settlers came to Massachusetts Bay, most of whom landed in Boston, a great portion settling there. Cromwell and Hampton were among those who contemplated settling in New England. Then the political tide turned in England, and with the rise of the Puritan party, the stream of emigration largely subsided. The Congregational churches, the first in date to flourish in Massachusetts Bay, were the outcome of the Puritan influx. It is to be borne in mind that the Puritans, unlike the Pilgrims of Plymouth, were not separatists. They were originally reformers within the English Church, but when they came to the new country, they found nothing to reform, either in church or in government. Thus, they were forced to create. This brought into being a church almost the duplicate of that of the separatists in the adjoining colony, a self-sustaining, self-governing religious unit. The first church of the Boston settlement had been founded before they left Charlestown under a covenant adopted by Winthrop, Thomas Dudley, Isaac Johnson, and the pastor, John Wilson. It bound the members to walk in our ways according to the rule of the gospel, and in all sincere conformity to his, Christ's, holy ordinances, and in mutual love and respect to each other, so near as God shall give us grace. Under the intent to reform, qualified by the conditions of pioneering, there was thus brought about, naturally and peaceably, a great religious revolution. In Boston, as well as in all of the rest of Massachusetts Bay, the religious test came to be applied to citizenship. In the general court held in Boston, it was ordered that for the time to come no man shall be admitted to the freedom of this body politic but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the same. This was at first no very oppressive test, for the early settlers were all of one mind religiously, but it did establish a state church. The church government was liberal. Within this church there was pure democracy. The ministers had great influence, but they were not entrenched as to powers. A sermon regularly preceded election, but it was not to be one in which the citizenship were to be told for whom to vote. And when, in an election sermon, Reverend John Cotton preached upon the inadvisability of superseding experienced officials, Governor Winthrop was immediately defeated. The town was governed by the town meeting system. The citizens of the town met together at least once a year, and usually oftener. There they fixed taxes, made appropriations, voted on municipal improvements, and elected the town officers. It was absolutely democratic. The right of vote and speech on any and all matters belonged to every citizen within the assemblage. As the commercial advantages of Boston became known, the importance of the town increased. At the same time, the difficulties of carrying on the Puritan theocratic government became more and more apparent. There was an influx into Boston of immigration which had nothing in common with the spirit of the pioneers. Self-betterment, commercial advantages, became its impetus in place of the zeal of the early settlers and their desire to worship freely without touch of rivalry or opposition. Not only did the Puritans oppose sects, but they abused individuals. The banishing of Roger Williams, and later of Anne Hutchinson, are examples of personal intolerance. The witchcraft delusion did not pass Boston by. It was a superstition which put its stamps on many communities in both the Old and New Worlds. It was to come to its most ghastly American fruition in Salem. In Boston, there were 2 or 3 cases which culminated in the execution of the persons accused. The notable Boston divine, Cotton Mather, espoused the delusion and argued for it in various polemical books, and even went to Salem and attended an execution, replying to the victim's speech, which had aroused the spectators almost to the point of rescue, and assuring them the sentence was just. In spite of the rigor of Puritan rule, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the theocratic principle in Boston. The colony, as a whole, was not discontented, but it was in Boston that the commercial population made itself felt. They were not impelled by religious reformation, but by clear, cold figures of pounds and shillings. They included able and intelligent men who did not join a congregational church and therefore could not achieve the franchise, nor could they worship in a church of their own faith. A party among the Puritans, which espoused the trader's cause, came to be known as the Moderates, and were strongly opposed by the radical theocrats of the unyielding type. The struggle was finally carried to England, where the influence of the trading class brought about the abrogation of the old colonial charter in 1686. This led to the first defiance of authority in the New England colonies. The abrogation of the charter was succeeded by a brief interval under the presidency of Joseph Dudley, son of one of the original settlers, Governor Thomas Dudley. Then the new royal governor arrived in person of Sir Edmund Andros. He was an honest and well-intentioned man, but he governed autocratically. His administration drove the divided Puritans, radical and moderate, together again. The residents of Boston, learning that William of Orange had landed in England, made common cause with the Revolution, and on April 18, 1689, they rose, seized and deposed Andros, kept him in comparatively easy confinement for nearly a year, and sent him back to England. A new charter was granted by William. It assured the colonies in their liberties and freedom of worship, but it protected the English churchmen in their right of worship, and extended the franchise so that it no longer rested on church membership. The election of governor was never restored to the people while under English rule. Under the provincial charter, which approximately began in the 18th century, Boston and Massachusetts history are closely interwoven. In the middle of the 18th century, the population was about 15,000. The houses were principally of wood, some of brick and stone. The town maintained a town watch and an organization of fire wards, but it suffered from destructive fires in 1676, 1690, 1711, 1747, and 1760. The town had 17 churches in 1750, the larger number being congregational, but there were other denominations represented as well: Episcopal, Anabaptist, French Huguenot, and Quaker. Although the religious test had been abolished for suffrage, the town continued to make money grants to the congregational churches and foster them officially. On this day in history, April 19th, 1677, the French army captures the town of Cambrai, held by Spanish troops. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Cambrai, a town of northern France, the seat of an archbishop and capital of an arrondissement in the department of Nord, 37 miles south by southeast of Lille, on the main line of the Northern Railway. Population from 1936, 29,246. Cambrai is situated on the right bank of the canalized Schelde, arms of which traverse the west of the town. Formerly strongly fortified, the ramparts had given way before the War of 1914-18, in which Cambrai figured prominently and was badly damaged, to handsome boulevards. Cambrai is the ancient Nervian town of Camaracum, mentioned in the Antonine Itinerary. In the 5th century, it was the capital of the Frankish king Ragocarius. Fortified by Charlemagne, it was captured and pillaged by the Normans in 870, and unsuccessfully besieged by the Hungarians in 953. During the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, it was the scene of frequent hostilities between the bishop and the citizens, but the latter ultimately effected their independence. In 1478, Louis XI, who obtained the town on the death of Charles the Bold, handed it over to the emperor, and in the 16th century, Charles V built a strong citadel for the erection of which castles of cavaliers and escudevers were demolished. From that day to the Peace of Nimwegen of 1678, which assigned it to France, it frequently changed hands by capture or treaty. The League of Cambrai is the name given to the alliance of Pope Julius II, Louis XII, Maximilian I, and Ferdinand the Catholic against the Venetians in 1508. The Peace of Cambrai, the Ladies' Peace, was concluded in the town in 1529 by Louise of Savoy, mother of Francis I, and Margaret of Austria, aunt of Charles V, in the names of these monarchs. The bishopric of Cambrai, dating from the 5th century, was raised in 1559 to the rank of an archbishopric, which continued till the Revolution and was later restored. The bishops received the title of count from the Emperor Henry I, 919 to 936, and in 1510 were raised to the dignity of dukes. Their territory, including the town itself and its territory called Cambraises. In World War I, Cambrai was occupied by the Germans from August 26, 1914 to October 8, 1918. When they retired, they left the town heavily mined, and the central portion was wrecked. Heavy fighting also took place in the area during World War II, May 1940, when an unsuccessful offensive was launched by the French to cut off a German spearhead, driving west to Abbeville. The former Cathedral of Cambrai was destroyed after the Revolution. The present Cathedral of Notre Dame is a church of the 19th century, built on the site of the old Abbey Church of Saint Sepulchre. It was severely damaged in 1918. Among other monuments, it contains that of Fenelon, archbishop from 1695 to 1715. The Church of St. Géry, 18th century, contains, among other works of art, a marble Renaissance rod screen. The Place des Armes, a large square in the center of the town, is bordered on the north by the Hôtel de Ville, 1863. The Tower of St. Martin is an old church tower of the 15th and 18th centuries, transformed into a belfry. The triple stone portal, which gave an entrance to the former archiepiscopal palace, is a work of the Renaissance period. Cambrai has a sub-prefect, tribunals of first instance and of commerce, a board of trade arbitrators, and a chamber of commerce. There is a museum of antiquities and objects of art. Wool spinning and weaving, bleaching and dyeing are carried on. Before World War II, the town had regained importance. There was beet sugar works and trade in coal, cattle, and grain. On this day in history, April 20th, 1657, English Admiral Robert Blake destroys a Spanish silver fleet under heavy fire from the shore at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the port. Santa Cruz de Tenerife, or de Santiago, a seaport and the capital of Tenerife and of the Canary Islands, in 28 degrees 28 minutes north and 16 degrees 15 minutes west, on the east coast. Population of 1940, 117,429. Santa Cruz occupies a small plain which is bounded by rugged volcanic rocks, and seamed by watercourses which are dry almost throughout the year. Scarcely any vegetation, except cactuses and euphorbias, is to be seen in the neighborhood. Almost the entire town was built in the 19th century, when its population more than trebled. There are many good public buildings, including a school of navigation, technical institute, library, natural history museum, and hospital. An aqueduct 5 miles long brings pure water from the mountains of the interior. Dromedaries from the adjacent islands of Lanzarote and Fuerteventura are used to convey merchandise and in agriculture. The town was bombarded by the British fleet under Blake in 1657 and by Nelson, who lost his arm during the attack in 1797. Some British flags lost on the occasion hang in one of the churches. Santa Cruz is an important coaling station and commercial center. On this day in history, April 21st, 753 BC, Romulus founds Rome. This is the traditional date. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Romulus. Romulus, the son of Mars by the Vestal Rhea Silvia, or Ilia, daughter of Numitor, who had been dispossessed of the throne of Alba by his younger brother Amulus. Romulus and Remus, the twin sons of Silvia, were placed in a trough and cast into the Tiber by their granduncle. The trough grounded in the marshes where Rome afterwards stood, under the wild fig tree, Ficus ruminalis, which was still holy in later days. The babes were suckling by a she-wolf and fed by a woodpecker, and then fostered by Acca Laurentia, wife of the shepherd Faustulus. They became leaders of a warlike band of shepherds on the Palatine, and in course of time were recognized by their grandfather, whom they restored to his throne, slaying Amulius. They now founded a city on the site where they had been nurtured. Later a quarrel broke out and Remus was slain. Romulus strengthened his band by offering an asylum to outcasts and fugitives, found wives for them by capture, and waged war with their kinsmen. His most formidable foe was Titus Tatus, king of the Sabines. But after an obstinate struggle, he and Romulus united their forces and reigned side by side till Tatus was slain at Lavinium in the course of a blood feud with Laurentum. Romulus then reigned alone till he suddenly disappeared in a storm. He was thereafter worshipped as a god under the name of Quirnus. Various rationalizing accounts also exist of the legend. The whole story, probably first given by the annalist Fabius Pictor and Cincius Alimentus, is artificial and shows strong Greek influence. The birth, exposure, rescue, and subsequent adventures of the twins are a Greek tale of a familiar type. Mars and his sacred beast, the wolf, are introduced on account of the great importance of this cult. The localities described are ancient sacred places. The Lupercal, near the Ficus ruminalis, was naturally explained as the she-wolf's den. The asylum is pure Greek, both name and institution. The story was probably invented to give an explanation of the sacred spot named Inter Doas Lucas, between the Arcs and the Capitol. Another Greek touch is the deification of an eponymous hero. The rape of the Sabine women is clearly aetiological, invented to account for the custom of simulated capture and marriage. These women, and also Titus Tatus, represent the Sabine element in the Roman population. The name Romulus means simply Roman. The derivation of Remus is obscure. Romulus is regarded as the founder of the military and political institutions, as Numa and his counterpart, Ancus Marcius, are of the religious institutions of Rome. On this day in history, April 22nd, 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés establishes a settlement at Veracruz, Mexico. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Veracruz, a city and seaport of Mexico in the state of Veracruz, on a slight indentation of the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in 19 degrees 11 minutes 50 seconds north, 96 degrees 20 minutes west. Slightly sheltered by some small islands and reefs. Population from 1940, 70,958. Veracruz is the most important port of the Republic. It is 263 miles by rail east of the City of Mexico, with which it is connected by 2 lines of railway. It is built on a flat, sandy, barren beach only a few feet above sea level. The harbor is confined to a comparatively narrow channel inside a line of reefs and small islands, which is exposed to the full force of northern storms. New port works were completed towards the end of the 19th century, which by means of breakwaters afford complete protection. In 1905, the 4 railway companies having terminal stations in Veracruz united in the organization of a joint terminal association, with Union Station, tracks, warehouses, quays, cranes, etc. Veracruz dates from 1520, soon after the first landing there of Cortés. This settlement was called Villa Rica de Veracruz, but was soon after moved to the harbor of Bernal in 1525 to a point now called Old Veracruz, and in 1599 to its present site. It was pillaged by privateers in 1653 and 1712, and this led to the erection of the celebrated fort of San Juan de Ulloa, or Ushoa, on one of the reefs in front of the city. In 1838, it was captured by the French. On March 29, 1847, by an American army under General Winfield Scott, who made Veracruz a base for his march upon the City of Mexico, and in 1861 by the French. Felix Diaz, nephew of President Diaz, captured Veracruz on October 15, 1912, in a revolt against the Madero government. Surprised by federal troops, he was taken prisoner on October 22nd and interned in Ulloa Fort. Naval forces of the United States landed in Veracruz on April 21st, 1914, seized the port, and thereby brought about the resignation of President Huerta. They held the city until November 23rd, 1914. On this day in history, April 23rd, 1016, Edmund Ironside succeeds his father, Ethelred the Unready, as King of England. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Edmund. Edmund, or Eadmund, circa 980 to 1016, called Ironside, King of the English, was the son of Ethelred II, the Unready, by his wife Emma, or Ealgifu. When Canute invaded England in 1015, Edmund was betrayed and deserted by the ealdorman Edric, who went over to Canute, and Wessex submitted to the Danish king. Next year, Canute and Edric together harried Mercia, while Edmund, with infinite difficulty, gathered an army. His attack on the invaded districts of Northumbria was brought to an end by Canute's northward march, and he was forced to return to London. The death of Ethelred on April 23, 1016, was followed by a double election to the English crown. The citizens of London chose Edmund. The rest of the Witten meeting at Southampton elected Canute. In the warfare which ensued, Edmund fought at the severest disadvantage, for his armies dispersed after every engagement. Canute besieged London, but the citizens successfully resisted all attacks. Edmund, meanwhile, received the submission of Wessex. At Penn in Somersetshire, he engaged the Danes and defeated them. Canute now raised the siege of London, and, after being defeated by Edmund at Penn, came into conflict with him again at Shurston and Wiltshire. The battle was indecisive, but Canute left Edmund in possession of Wessex. Edmund hastened after him and relieved London, which Canute was besieging. He defeated the Danes at Brentford and at Otford, and drove them into Sheppey. He was now joined by Edric, with whom he followed the Danes into Essex, overtaking them at Assendam, or Ashington. In the battle which ensued, Edric again played the traitor, and the English were routed. Edmund retired into Gloucestershire, whither he was followed by Canute. Edric and the Witan then persuaded Edmund to accept a reconciliation, which took place at Olney. The kingdom was divided, Canute taking the north, Edmund the south. Soon afterwards, Edmund died, November 30th, 1016, probably from natural causes, though later historians hint at foul play. On this day in history, April 24th, 1547, at the Battle of Muhlberg, Duke of Alba, commanding Spanish imperial forces of Charles I of Spain, defeats the troops of the Schmalkaldic League. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, going over the history of the town. Muhlberg, a town of Germany, in Prussian Saxony, on the left bank of the Elbe, 8 miles below the Rhisia, population of 1933, 3,597. It manufactures bricks, baskets, and matches. Muhlberg is famous for the victory gained here in 1547 by the Emperor Charles V over the Elector of Saxony, John Frederick. On this day in history, April 25th, 1134, the name Zagreb was mentioned for the first time in the Felician Charter relating to the establishment of the Zagreb bishopric around 1094. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Zagreb. Zagreb, the capital of Croatia, Slovenia, Yugoslavia, German Agram, lies on the Sava, with a background of mountains and surrounded by vineyards and country houses. Population of 1931, 185,581. In 1910, it was only 79,083. But the influx of officials and businessmen after the formation of the state of Yugoslavia more than outweighed the exodus of the Magyars and the Germans. Zagreb is the second city of Yugoslavia and its commercial and financial center, with many important trade associations. It was also the headquarters of one of the 5 army provinces. The older part of the town, with narrow, winding streets, contains the 15th century Gothic cathedral and the bishop's palace, while the newer part, with wide streets, open squares, a park, and botanical gardens, contains the business and industrial quarters. Here, too, are the Palace of Justice, the Southern Slavonic Academy, the university, a synagogue, and a Protestant church. Roman Catholic schools and churches are numerous, and there is also a school of music. Tobacco, leather, linen, carpets, war material, hats and caps, boots, paper, chemicals, varnish, and oil colors are made. Modern excavations have shown that a settlement existed at Zagreb in Roman times, and though the Croats probably built a town there in the 7th century, the first written record of the city occurs in 1093, when King Ladislaus of Hungary made it the see of a bishop. The older part of Zagreb, known as the Capitol, contains the bishop's palace and the 15th century Gothic cathedral, surrounded by the towers of the 11th century fortress. In 1242, a walled town, now called the Upper Town, arose on a neighboring hill, and was raised to the rank of a royal free town by King Bela of Hungary. For centuries, a bitter feud raged between the capital and the Upper Town, until these rivals were forced to join hands against the Turks. Zagreb, already the political center of Croatia-Slovenia, was selected as the capital in 1867. It suffered severely from earthquakes in 1880 and 1901. It became the home of an aristocracy and a seat of culture on a level with more famous European centers. It was also the center of the Yugoslav movement before 1918, and in that year a National Assembly met there and proclaimed Croatia's adhesion to the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Soon, however, serious differences arose between Croat national aspirations for autonomy and Serb tendencies towards centralization. Zagreb became the seat of the Croat autonomists, when in April 1941, after the partition of Yugoslavia, an independent Croatia was created. Zagreb became its capital. On this day in history, April 26, 1865, Union cavalry corner and shoot dead John Wilkes Booth, assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, in Virginia. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Booth. John Wilkes Booth, born 1839, died 1865, American actor, assassin of President Lincoln, was born in Harford County, Maryland, in 1839. He was the son of Junius Brutus and the brother of Edwin Thomas Booth, and an actor of prominence. He sympathized with the South in the American Civil War, and in 1865 organized a conspiracy to assassinate the president, the vice president, and members of the cabinet. On the night of April 14, 1865, while Lincoln was watching a play from a box at Ford's Theater in Washington, Booth stealthily entered the box and discharged a pistol at the head of the president from behind, the ball penetrating the brain. Brandishing a huge knife, the assassin rushed through the stage box, leaped down upon the stage, and escaped from the building. He was pursued, and 12 days later was shot in a barn where he had concealed himself. On this day in history, April 27th, 1539, the official founding of the city of Bogota, New Granada, nowadays Colombia, by Nicolaus Federman and Sebastián de Belalcázar. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Bogota. Bogota, or Santa Fe de Bogota, the capital of the Republic of Colombia and of the Interior Department of Cundinamarca. Population in 1938, 325,658. The city is on the eastern margin of a large elevated plateau, 8,563 feet above sea level. The plateau may be described as a great bench or shelf on the western slope of the eastern Cordilleras, about 70 miles long and 30 miles wide, with a low rim on its western margin and backed by a high ridge on the east. The plain forming the plateau appears to be an old lacustrine basin and has numerous small lakes remaining and many streams. These streams, one of which, the San Francisco, passes through the city, unite near the southwestern extremity of the plateau and form the Rio Funza, or Bogota, which finally plunges over the edge of the Tequendama in a beautiful perpendicular fall of about 475 feet. The city is built upon a sloping plain at the base of two mountains, La Guadalupe and Montserrat, upon whose crests stand two imposing churches. From a broad avenue on the upper side, downward to the west, slope the streets, through which run streams of cool, fresh water from the mountains above. The north and south streets cross these at right angles, and the blocks thus formed are like great terraces. A number of handsomely laid out plazas or squares, ornamented with gardens and statuary, have been preserved. On these face the principal public buildings and churches. In Plaza Bolivar is the statue of Bolivar by Pietro Tenarani, 1789 to 1869, a pupil of Canova, and its Plaza Santander is one of General Francisco de Paulo Santander, 1792 to 1840, facing on Plaza de la Constitución, are in the capital and cathedral. Owing to the prevalence of earthquakes, private houses are usually of one story, built of sun-dried bricks, whitewashed. Railway lines connect the city of Bogota with the major settlements of the plateau and the upper Magdalena River, and highway connections will soon link the city with the Pan-American highway system at Medellin. Bogota is an archiepiscopal see, founded in 1561, and is one of the strongholds of medieval clericalism in South America. It has a cathedral, rebuilt in 1814, and some 30 other churches, together with many old conventual buildings, now used for secular purposes. Their religious communities having been dissolved by Mosquera and their revenues devoted in great measure to education. The capital, which is occupied by the executive and legislative departments, is an elegant and spacious building erected since 1875. The interest which Bogota has always taken in education, and because of which she has been called the Athens of South America, is shown in the number and character of her institutions of learning: a university, several colleges and schools, a public library, a national observatory, a natural history museum, and a botanical garden. The city also possesses a well-equipped mint, little used in recent years. The plain surrounding the city is very fertile, intensively cultivated, and pastures cattle and produces cereals, vegetables, and fruit in abundance. It was the center of Chibcha civilization before the Spanish conquest and sustained a large population. The climate is mild. Bogota was founded in 1538 by Alonso Jimenez de Quesada and was named Santa Fe de Bogota after his birthplace Santa Fe, and after the southern capital of Chibchas, Bacata, or Funza. It was the capital of the Viceroyalty of Nueva Granada, and soon became one of the centers of Spanish colonial power and civilization on the South American continent. In 1811, its citizens revolted against Spanish rule and set up a government of their own, but in 1816 the city was occupied by Pablo Morillo, 1777 to 1838, the Spanish general, who subjugated it to a ruthless military government until 1819, when Bolivar's victory at Boyaca compelled its evacuation. On the creation of the Republic of Colombia, Bogota became its capital, and when that republic was dissolved into its three constituent parts, it remained the capital of Nueva Granada. On this day in history, April 28, 1503, the Battle of Carignola is fought. It is noted as one of the first European battles in history won by small arms fire using gunpowder. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of the town. Carignola, a town of Apulia, Italy, in the province of Foggia, 26 miles southeast by rail from the town of Foggia, population of 1936, 37,163 in the town, but in the commune, it's 39,540. It was rebuilt after a great earthquake in 1731. It has a considerable agricultural trade and also trade in merino and mattress wool. In 1503, the Spaniards under Galonzo de Cordoba defeated the Spanish under Duc de Nemours below the town, a victory which made the kingdom of Naples into a Spanish province in Italy. Carignola lies on the Via Traiana between Herdonai and Canasium. On this day in history, April 29, 1429, Joan of Arc arrives to relieve the siege of Orleans. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica going over the history of Orleans. Orleans, the chief town of Lorette, on the Loire, 77 miles south by southwest of Paris by rail. Population, from 1936, 70,780. Les Aubrais, a mile to the north, is one of the chief railway junctions in the country. An early trading post among the Gauls, Orleans was known as Genabum by the Romans, and led the revolt against Julius Caesar in 52 BC. In the 5th century, it had taken the name Aurelianum, from either Marcus Aurelius or Aurelian. It was vainly besieged in 451 by Attila and by Odoacer in 471, but Clovis took it in 498 and held it there in 511, the first ecclesiastical council assembled in France. It then became the capital of a separate kingdom, but was united with that of Paris in 613. In the 10th century, the town was taken in fief to the Counts of Paris, who in 987 ousted the Carolingians. Philip, 5th son of Philip VI, was the first Duke of Orleans. After the assassination of his successor, Louis, the people of Orleans sided with the Armagnacs, and thus brought upon themselves the attacks of the Burgundians and the English. Joan of Arc relieved the city in 1429. In 1562 it became the headquarters of Louis I of Bourbon, Prince of Conde, the Protestant commander-in-chief. In 1563, Francis, Duke of Guise, laid siege to it, but was assassinated. Orleans was surrendered to the king, who raised the fortifications. It was held by the Huguenots from 1567 to 1568. The St. Bartholomew massacre there, in 1572, lasted a week. It was given as a lieu de sûreté to the League under Henry III, but surrendered to Henry IV in person in 1594. The town is surrounded by boulevards and is connected with the suburbs of St. Marcel by an 18th century stone bridge of 9 arches. The river is canalized on the right, and serves as a continuation of the Orleans Canal. In the Place de Matreuil is a statue of Joan of Arc. A simple cross marks the site on the left bank of the Loire of the Fort des Tourelles, captured by Joan of Arc in 1429. The Cathedral of St. Croix, begun in 1287, was burned by the Huguenots in 1567 before its completion. Henry IV, in 1601, laid the first stone, the building of which continued until 1829. The Church of St. Agnon, mutilated by the Protestants, consists of a transcript and a choir of the second half of the 15th century. It contains in a gilded and carved wooden shrine the remains of its patron saint. Saint Ouvert, dedicated to one of the oldest bishops of Orleans, died 391, is an early Gothic building dating from the 13th, completely restored in the 15th century. The Church of St. Paul, 15th and 16th century, has an isolated tower, and the Notre Dame de Recouvrance was built between 1517 and 1519 in the Renaissance style and dedicated to the memory of the deliverance of the city. The Hôtel de Ville, built under Francis I and Henry II and restored in the 19th century, was formerly the residence of the governors of Orléans and was occupied by the kings and queens of France from Francis II to Henry IV. The public library comprises among its manuscripts a number dating from the 7th century. The Salle des Fêtes, formerly the Corn Market, stands within a vast cloister formed by 15th century arcades, once belonging to the old cemetery. Among old houses are that of Agnes Sorel, 15th and 16th centuries, containing objects relating to Joan of Arc, that of Francis I, of the first half of the 16th century, that occupied by Joan of Arc during the siege of 1429, and that known as the House of Diane de Poitiers, 16th century, which contains the Historical Museum. The anniversary of the raising of the siege in 1429 by Joan of Arc is celebrated yearly. Orléans is the seat of a bishopric under the Archbishop of Paris, a prefect, a court of appeal, and a court of assizes and headquarters of the 5th Army Corps. The more important industries are the manufacture of tobacco by the state, blankets, pins, vinegar, machinery, agricultural implements, hosiery, tools, and ironware, and the preparation of preserved vegetables. Wine, wool, grain, and livestock are commercial staples, round which there are important nurseries. On this day in history, April 30th, 1315, Enguerrand de Marigny is hanged at the instigation of Charles, Count of Valois. Included in the following is an excerpt from the 1944 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica going over the history of Enguerrand. Enguerrand de Marigny, born 1260, died 1315, French statesman, was born at Lyon-la-Forêt in Normandy. After the death of Pierre Follet and Hughes de Bonneville at the Battle of Monin-Pével in 1304, he became Philip IV's Grand Chamberlain and Chief Minister. In 1306, he was sent to preside over the exchequer of Normandy. He received numerous gifts of land and money from Philip, as well as a pension from Edward II of England. He was an able instrument of Philip's policy, and shared the popular odium which Philip incurred by debasing the coinage. He obtained rich appointments for many of his relatives, and secured increased revenue for the king. His peace with the Flemings in 1314 disappointed the princes of the blood. He was accused of receiving bribes, and Charles of Valois denounced him to the king himself, but Philip stood by him. After the death of Philip IV on November 29, 1314, the feudal party, whose power the king had tried to limit, turned on his ministers, and chiefly on his chamberlain. Enguerrand was arrested, and 28 articles of accusation, including charges of receiving bribes, were brought against him. He refused a hearing, but his accounts were correct, and Louis was inclined to spare him anything more than banishment to the island of Cyprus. Charles of Valois then brought forward a charge of sorcery. Enguerrand was condemned at once and hanged on the public gallows at Montfaucon, protesting that in all his acts he had only been carrying out Philip's commands. April 30th, 1315.